We have another great panel, and Mr. Paul, I can be back down a little bit because I'm pretty loudmouth. So we have a great panel, and I don't say that just because I happen to be on it. So I told them whenever we were prepping for this, those of y'all who know me out there will laugh about this, but I'm going to kind of keep my remarks on this panel short because I want you to hear from them more. So that said, I want to introduce, she's another individual that really needs no introduction, because if you know anything about K12 and computer science, you know Dr. Katie Hendrickson. She is, I always butcher her title, so I'm not even going to attempt it. But I will tell you, Katie has been a great friend to the state of Arkansas. I pick on her all the time about saying that she has received the unfortunate experience of being assigned to us as a liaison from K12 to our state. But I will tell you that Katie is a great advocate for our students, our state, computer science, and Arkansas, and I'm so appreciative of the work she does. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce everybody else. And thank you, Katie, for being here.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, Anthony. It's always good to be back in Arkansas. But first of all, who decided that our panel is going to be after the last one? I know. I don't know how we're going to be able to follow that, but we'll try. So yeah, very thrilled to be here on this panel and sharing the stage with these distinguished panelists. And really excited to take the conversation beyond just why computer science. I think everybody here in this room agrees that we need computer science in every single school, but really start digging into the details about how to do this. We have folks representing 20-some different states here, and I really want to get to some ideas that other states can do and hear what other states are doing to advance computer science education opportunities. So I'm Dr. Katie Hendrickson, as Anthony introduced me. I lead the Code.org Advocacy Coalition. We are a coalition of 80+ industry, nonprofit, and advocacy organizations. Many folks here are part of that coalition, and I thank you so much for your work to prioritize and support computer science. But essentially, we work on policies. We work on state policy. We have a framework of 9 state policies that we work with states to implement. And if you're not familiar with those, they are in your state handouts that you have. The QR codes on the tents on the tables will take you directly to that 100-page report, and you can see a detailed explanation of each of these 9. So we're going to talk a little bit about these policies. Essentially, they are attempting to make computer science a foundational part of K-12 education. We want computer science to be just like math and science and social studies and language arts in schools. And this is the path, this is the framework to get to that point. All right, so I'm going to introduce my panelists now. To my left, we have Dr. Joshua Childs. He is the co-PI of the Expanding Computing Education Pathways Alliance, otherwise known as ESEP, and assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Next, we have Dr. Leanne DeLizer. She is the co-founder and executive director of CS for All. And then we have Anu Shaker. She's the director of equitable computer science education for Microsoft, and she works on the TEALS program as well. Then we have Jeremy Anderson. He is the president of the Education Commission of the States. And then finally, Anthony Owen. You all probably know him well, but he is the Arkansas State Director of Computer Science. All right, so everybody here on the panel has worked on computer science education policy and knows how important it is. We're now 10 years into Computer Science Education Week. It's been around for a decade, more than a decade actually. We now have policies in every single state. We have people in every state who are focused on expanding computer science at universities, at state departments of education across the state. Everybody's working on this now and sees it as being really important. And we've seen the growth. Hadi talked about this. Governor Hutchinson talked about the growth over the past 3 years, 5 years, 8 years. But I really want to get to what do we need to prioritize next? So we have the framework. We've seen what states are doing. But how do we keep moving forward What policies should we be focusing our efforts on? And what really makes the biggest difference in equitable access and participation in computer science? So Leanne, I'm going to start with you.
Great, thanks, Katie. I think one of the things when we talk about policy and implementation of computer science education, we actually have to link those words really closely. It's not just about the policy, but it's about the understanding of that policy and the implementation of that policy on the ground. You and I met a long time ago when we were writing the K12 computer science framework, and there's a wonderful video that was produced as a part of that work. And there's this moment in the video where I say, education is hard work. And that was true a decade ago, and it's true today. Our systems for education are complex, they're multifaceted, and I think one of the things that the 9 policies do and the work that we're seeing happening on the ground here in Arkansas and many of the states is they're coming at this, chipping away at the edges, right, in order to get to the whole system. So at CS for All, we really try and think about what is the big systems approach to computer science education. What are the state level policies? How are they experienced by school districts on the ground? How do school district and school leaders make decisions that either make it harder or easier for teachers to implement in their classrooms? And then what is the role of our university system, both in taking those kids, as we heard from the panel, into the next level of their education, but also thinking about preparing our teachers and getting them ready, because we can train 1 million teachers, but those 1 million teachers are going to retire. Hopefully some of them will become school principals. I can't wait to see my first computer science teacher school superintendent, right? And they are going to need to be replaced. So how do we also think about pre-service education, making computer science a part not only of every student's academic journey, but every teacher's academic journey? We heard the students call out the importance of weaving computer science in different disciplines. We hear Code.org has released that new connections curriculum. So our English teachers should also experience, at least 5th grade computer science as a part of their preparation. And so for us, thinking about the whole system, how do we take the great policy work, think about the deciders who are local, who are making implementation choices, and then create pipelines for teachers so that every teacher is prepared to step in, at least at an entry level in those classrooms, and then help make master teachers over time as they gain practice and experience.
Yeah, excellent points. Anyone else like to jump in?
I'll just quickly add here, I completely agree, especially with the last point that you mentioned in terms of capacity building, and that's really the area that we as Microsoft are focusing on as well with our TEALS program and our grant-making efforts to organizations such as CS for All and CSDA and Code.org. They're doing incredible work in this space. With the TEALS program, the way that the model works is we support the teachers in learning and growing their computer science content knowledge. We have volunteers from the industry who teach along with the teachers, and until the teacher is comfortable to take on that CS knowledge and CS teaching on their own. Sometimes that takes 2 years, sometimes 4 years, as long as it takes until the teacher is fully able to take on the content themselves. And that, of course, requires a lot of work and a lot of support from various groups and partners, and so definitely think that that's one area that is a kind of a key focus when it comes to policy.
Okay, so we joke sometimes with Arkansas that whenever they do something new, we have to add that into our 9 policy framework. So now Arkansas has a graduation requirement where all students have to take computer science before they graduate. That's not one of the 9 policies, but we're starting to see this as a trend. South Carolina and Nevada have a computer science graduation requirement. The Rhode Island Department of Education is recommending it as part of their updated graduation requirements. So we're starting to see this. But there's also some concern about it. So I'm curious, I want to start with Anthony. First of all, how do we convince folks that we need to add computer science into graduation requirements? I know it's challenging. And then second, how do we ensure that states are set up to be able to support this really well and to implement it well?
Yeah, Katie, thank you for the question. I feel like what Arkansas has done successfully in getting this in place is that we built that foundation. So the convincing was not very hard. We showed through continued growth in our students enrollment, voluntary student enrollment in high school. As Governor Hutchinson said earlier, we went from under 3,000 to over 12,000 voluntarily enrolled. And just for context, Arkansas has about 500,000 students K through 12 across our entire state. So that is still a significant portion. You're not going to convince a state or state leaders if they haven't taken the steps, because they start seeing this mountain, this wall that they're just facing all at once. But we went from under 20 teachers to over 600 certified teachers now during that time frame. During the first 5 years of this initiative, Governor Hutchinson made it very clear that he wanted it to be an option for students, but he also wanted us building the infrastructure so we could eventually get to that place where we could make it a requirement. So as we're going out and we're talking and advising other states, or you're thinking about it within your state, if you have not built taking those 9 policies and implemented those in some form or fashion. Now, not every state can do all 9, we understand that, but there should be some portions that you've done along the way. And once you've implemented those and built that infrastructure in place, you don't have to convince them. Guess who's going to convince them? Students like Caden and Lamaya and Sarah. They're going to be the people who convince our leaders that we need this. But it's because of teachers like Brenda, Kimberly, and Ashley that our job in convincing was fairly simple. So it's all about getting those pieces in place, Kate.
Yeah.
And I want to add something too. I think, what I'm hearing from Anthony is thinking about, we need to also be thinking about the unintended consequences of having graduation requirements as well. And by meaning if we don't also ensure that students have access to high quality curriculum and teachers who are properly and engagedly trained in providing computer science access, then what does that mean for a student when they graduate but haven't really fully learned and grasped the concepts of computer science? What does it mean then for a student who's gone through the graduation or going through the process and says, you know what, this isn't for me, I'm gonna drop out, or I'm gonna take a step back, or I'm not sure how this relates to my experience. So I also think as we begin to build these requirements, to think about some of those unintended consequences so that we are building a pipeline, a pathway for all of our students to graduate with computer science.
Yeah, thank you.
And Josh, I would just add, this is hard. I mean, Arkansas has done this well, but over multiple years. To add another requirement is a lot for a state when they have students who may not be ready to graduate because of the impacts of the pandemic also. So we're going to need to work with states to build up some of that. I would go back, though, to the student panel and what Lamaya said, money. Money will help a lot of these legislatures and state agencies and chiefs and governors see this differently, because the old economic development model is we need to bring an IT company into our state and have them build a building there, and then we will create the workforce for them. Well, not anymore, and especially because of this pandemic. But we're going to have to help those policymakers understand that if you have qualified individuals who are getting computer science degrees, you're probably going to be making money off the income tax that you are charging, even though they're not working in a company that's in your state, but they are working in your state with where they're located. This is a dramatic change for economic development for states across the country. And I think it is going to take some time to educate them on how valuable that will be.
Yeah, Jeremy, you and I were talking last night, and I said the old model of the richest man in town no longer applies, because the richest man in town used to live in your town, right? Do you remember those old 1980s movies and the 90s movies where the bad guy who owned the car dealership, right? And then Patrick Swayze came in and took over the bar and fixed it. But that guy still lived in town. And he bought his groceries in the grocery store, and he bought his car from the car dealership, and he took his wife out to dinner at the country club. And his income from the town stayed in town. Your richest man in town now lives in Seattle. And so how do we create an opportunity for funds to come back into your community? And so by putting people who work for those companies, who work for Amazon and Google, who take funds out of our economic islands, right? How does that money come back in? It comes back into the salaries and the payroll of the people who are going to work there. And I think if we can get them the high-paying jobs within those companies, that really does help to cycle some of that funds back into your community that otherwise would go out to these companies and not return.
Yeah, and what a great point about your community and the economic development and sustainability. I want to turn to the other side. I'm glad that we started talking about money. I'm going to turn to the other side of money, which is that we can't do this without funding. And we need dedicated state funding. We need philanthropy. So it's so important to make sure that this initiative is sustainable. We know that right now, general education funding isn't going to computer science. So we need other ways to ensure that we can get this in schools. And Anu, I want to start with you. Tell us how funding works, how it can work best, and what are some best practices here?
Yeah, and I just want to say first, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk here with these incredible individuals about such an important topic, and funding being a crucial topic amongst those. I just want to start off by talking about, Hadi talked about the why, and we've all been talking about the why, and I'm glad we're having this discussion also about the how and the where in conjunction with the why. We've been talking about the economy and the direction that it's moving in, and just the obvious reasons why computer science education needs to be a priority in terms of funding. I think philanthropic funding and state funding go hand in hand, and we all need to be working together with all of the work that we're doing. From Microsoft's perspective, in terms of our philanthropic funding, we have two areas, and I talked about this a little bit earlier. We have our grant-making efforts, where we're supporting, incredible organizations that have really important impact in this space. And we've also invested in our own program, which is the TEALS program, with the capacity building of teachers. To give you an idea of some of the scale of the program, we have about 500 high schools that we've currently partnered with for this school year. About close to 700 classes across those 500 high schools. So that many teachers where that capacity is being built to be able to teach that. But of course, still a lot more work to be done in that space. And I think we're also, it's really just about the teachers, the individual teachers. It's about, we have a teacher, Judy Dent in Detroit, completely started from scratch, is now taking on 2 computer science classes. Another teacher, Marcia Gaspard from New Orleans, similar story, starting from scratch, and they're really learning along with the students, and the students are learning computer science also and being exposed for the first time. We heard from Sarah and Lamaya and Caden about their stories, and there are similar stories out there that we need to get access to, and really it's about building that access to computer science. I know the State of CS report talks a little bit about access and participation, and that's what we're trying to do with our efforts, and really it's about us all working together to be able to achieve that together, and funding needs to work hand in hand on that.
Yeah, Anthony.
Katie, if I can just briefly, the private partnerships, we have such a great relationship with Microsoft Philanthropies, and thank y'all for all the support that y'all give us. But for the other state leaders out there, I cannot emphasize how important it is for the state themselves to show skin in the game, so to speak. And that was one thing that Governor Hutchinson had the vision to do early on. He started this initiative with discretionary grant funding, but immediately started work getting it in our state legislature, in our state budget as a line item. That shows ongoing commitment. That shows that legacy piece that he has created. That will go beyond his administration. If you're relying on just private funding or one-time funding as a state, you're setting yourself up for a failure. And I will tell you this as a past classroom teacher, and Secretary Key has heard me say this before, I don't like funding one-time money type programs, because I can tell you as a classroom teacher, there was nothing more frustrating than the state coming out and sending this new thing down the pipeline, and we all have to go through training on it. It's the best thing since sliced bread, and then 3 years later, guess what? There's no more funding for it. And we've just spent all that effort. So about the third time that happens to you as a teacher, you're done learning the new thing. You just like, I'll wait until this one runs out of funding, and I'll do what I want to do anyway. So states have to have not just funding for this, but they have to have consistent and ongoing dedicated funding for this.
Yeah, excellent.
And I think we have to acknowledge that over time, what needs are on the ground are going to change, right? We've hit 50% of the schools, and I think, Anthony, one of the things that you've shown really well in Arkansas is that you have to keep up. Our teachers and our principals are some of the most creative problem solvers on the planet. You give them a challenge, they're going to make it work, right? Just like Anthony said, like, we're going to make it work. And if we don't keep up, we're going to keep trying to fund year 1 problems in year 10. And the teachers and the principals may have already moved on from that. They're going to need that injection funding to get the capacity building work constantly. But how do we keep that funding not targeted on what was the year one problem? So we do workshop with school districts called SCRIPT, where we take them through a strategic planning process for implementing high quality computer science education in pathways from K through 12. And what we're seeing in the last year and a half for SCRIPT is that almost all of our districts are setting goals around teacher professional learning. They're all doing teacher PD. But 90% of the schools setting those PD goals and targets are saying they're going to use internal capacity to build it. They're going to do teacher working groups after school. They're going to take that one super excited teacher that we've all been talking about who's in those numbers, and they're going to leverage them to create a working group within the building in order to get the rest of the teachers up to speed and on board. And so how do we support that? Because the schools don't want to send their teachers to costly out-of-town PD. They want to build what is actually the best high-quality PD, which is working groups where teachers can bring student artifacts, talk about them weekly, in the same way our math department meets on a regular basis, our English department meets on a regular basis. They want their teachers to talk about computer science and build their practice over time within those confines of the buildings. And so how do we keep up? How do we acknowledge that us as leaders may not have a picture of what they're doing best in schools and classes, and we really need to listen and follow sometimes, and not just lead from our position up here on stage.
Yeah, excellent point, and great point about building that internal capacity as well within the school building, the district, even at the state level. So I have one final question, and then hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes for questions from the audience, so y'all can be thinking about that for a moment. But I want to talk about equity. We've been talking about representation and representative enrollment in computer science. The data that we have in the State of Computer Science Education report shows that the gender gap is one of the most persistent. We know it's not because girls aren't interested in computer science, they are, but what is happening to make only 31% of students enrolled in computer science girls? And we see other gaps as well in various states. We see gaps for students from different races and ethnicities, English language learners, students with disabilities. And Josh, I'm going to start with you, but what can we do to engage these students and to make sure that the systems are set up to make sure that we're getting representative enrollment? We're not leaving these students behind.
Yeah, great question. And I think to answer this question, we've got to understand our position. And so indulge me here for a second. So it's the holiday season, and you decide you got to go get shopping gifts. You got to go get some gifts. And you make the mistake that you're going to go to the mall. And you want to go to Macy's. And what do you have to do to go find Macy's? You go and find the map of the mall. And on that map, there's going to be three things. The first thing it's going to tell you is where all the stores are, where the Macy's is, Foot Locker, the Nike store, they still have Radio Shacks, whatever, right? It's going to show you where those different stores are. The second thing that map's going to tell you is how to get there. So it's going to tell you that there's elevators, or escalators, or stairs, a hot air balloon that'll take you to the fourth floor of that mall. But the most important thing on that map, I would make the argument, is usually indicated by a circle that's blue or red, or an arrow, and it says, you are here. And when you understand where you are, when you use data and use the data and use the voices of the teachers and the students to tell you where you are, then you can then begin to move forward and begin to break down some of those systemic inequities, begin to provide equitable opportunities, begin to unthink deficit when it comes to expanding and broadening participation in computer science, and begin to think, what are the opportunities that we can provide students, and what can we learn from students and our educators in our building to expand equity across when it comes to computer science education. And so for me, I think one of the things is, how do we prepare and engage our school leaders and our district leaders to become computer science, not only advocates, but wanting to implement things inside school buildings and inside our districts? As someone who works in a department that trains superintendents and principals, I've been doing this study where I'm asking, so what do you know about computer science? And to a team, many of them are like, something with computers or coding. if we're not empowering the leaders that are in charge and overlooking our schools, our students, and our teachers to understand computer science, then how do we expect the teacher who's gone and spent their summer training and learning about computer science and learning the new ways in which to engage and getting new curriculum to then feel supported and empowered to then move the needle forward in their school when the principal doesn't really understand the landscape and the concept around computer science education? So for me, I think equity begins in focusing first on the school leaders, but more importantly, understanding where we are in this moment. And that not only means collectively, but also us individually in this work.
I'll just add quickly, I think completely agree with everything you just said, Josh. And I think from my perspective, racial equity is really about equity, not just racial equity, equity overall is really about being intentional about it. And that intentionality and really just thinking about having specific efforts targeted towards equity. And I know that means a lot of different things. For us, what we're doing with Microsoft with our TEALS program, we have asked schools to make commitments along the lines of a few different areas. So diverse enrollment being one, to address the issues of access and participation. And really, simple things like host an event to excite students, to debunk CS myths and, some of the CS stereotypes that the student panel talked about. Just do more of that awareness building. Another area that we ask our schools to make commitments on is inclusive instruction. So just making sure the curriculum has enough relevant examples that different students from different backgrounds can relate to, a variety of examples. Another area that we focus on, that we ask the schools to focus on, is inclusive learning spaces, making sure the classroom environment is inclusive once these students are in, to make sure that you have posters of role models or posters of different people from different walks of life that represent CS in a different form than some of the stereotypes have typically represented it. So those are just some examples of things that we do kind of at a ground level with the schools. Overall, one of the commitments, the large commitments that we made just a couple of years ago was to expand our efforts with a targeted, and again, speaking of intentionality and really being intentional about the efforts, we are targeting to be in about 620 high schools across 21 locations that we've chosen that have a significantly high proportion, and this speaks to the racial equity piece, that have a high proportion of Black and African American students enrolled in high schools. And really in those areas, and some of these examples of the areas are places like Atlanta, Memphis, New Orleans, Detroit, Milwaukee, and really across the US. And providing that access to computer science and working to build that teacher capacity and working with the schools to build that up. And I just want to also just end by saying thank you so much to, and really applaud the efforts of Governor Hutchinson, Anthony Owen, and the leadership team in Arkansas for driving an opportunity for all students to compete for the, I think, 2,300 plus computing jobs in Arkansas right now. So I just want to end again about being intentional with our equity efforts.
Yeah, I think we've got to look also at some of the higher ed aspects that are out there. I mean, we're in a country right now that when you look at the number of college graduates, the number of women receiving a degree is much higher than men. Well, that doesn't make sense if you go back to Sarah's comment that there's only 5 girls in her class of 30. So how do we help at a younger age to get the gender equity where it's the same number of males and females in a computer science class in high school, so that when we get to the higher ed side, we have a larger number of females who are in those computer science programs for some kind of an associate or bachelor's degree. And I think it's really important, if you look, again, back to what Lamaya said, the money. I mean, these are really good, high-paying jobs that are going to be around for a long time in our economy. And we need to make sure that we're giving everyone the opportunity to have those training and skills to be able to have that kind of a cost of living and make things work.
Yeah. And we can set state and federal policies across the board, right, that encourage and resource the implementation on the ground. But let's be real, those human children and teenagers are making decisions based on the humans who are around them, right? The brokers, the facilitators, the guidance counselors, their teachers, their parents, all of that. There's this really amazing study that was done in Kansas and Oklahoma where they asked parents about how important it was for kids to study science. So this is like back in the early 2000s, it was a while ago. 80% of parents said it's really important. People have to study science. Science is important in our world. It should be in schools. And then they asked about, well, should your kid have to be required to take science? 20% of parents said yes. So we have to be careful in the work that we're doing and promoting computer science education that we don't think about it only as like the career opportunities or the ones who are quote unquote interested in it, because we'll get a whole lot of important but not for me, right? It's really important. We need lots of people in it, but I'm not that technology stuff and not for my kid, right? So let's try and think about how do we open up those conversations, create broad pathways for the humans who are in the system, and to Josh's point, empower them to really make local decisions and interact one-to-one with those students who are possibly like on the fence and unsure, right? And so how do we move that work forward as a whole thing? And then I think both Josh, you and Jeremy said something really important. We value what we measure and we measure what we value. So if we go back to equity, I want to applaud Anthony and the work he's done here in Arkansas in creating a state dashboard for what computer science education is being implemented. And then you're not having conversations about why that community versus my community. It's like, here's the data, and we're just going to target the places where the data shows that it's not being implemented across the board with equity. So we wrote this report a year ago called CS Policy to Practice. And one of the real emerging trends that we heard from state leaders and school district leaders alike is that data dashboards like that can have a huge impactful meaningfulness for school administrators, because then they see what the finish line looks like and they don't have to try and distill it from all of these messages that are flying around in the space.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's an excellent way to close up our panel. If you have questions, note that we will have a networking lunch, so you'll have an opportunity to come up and talk to all of these distinguished panelists about the questions that you have. But yeah, that is a great way to end, and I could really listen to all of you talk all day about your passion for this work and the priorities and importance. So thank you all so much for being here. This was fantastic.
Thank y'all. Please give my fellow panelists a hand. And also a hand for Katie for moderating. She did a great job. We will have just a short transition period, 5 minutes. However, I do want to address one thing that was said. I wish I could take credit for our state data dashboard, but I cannot. Regent Sakar, who is one of our assistant commissioners, his team did such a great job creating that dashboard, and that team needs to get the credit for that. So I thank them for that work.